So we were in Vienna yesterday just to visit our younger daughter and to check up on her. She's living in Vienna and going to school there. And even though we lived in Vienna for 7 years, and I passed by this building so many times in the first district, yesterday I took the opportunity to visit Martin Buber's Geburtshaus. So Buber was born in Vienna, right across from the Donau, or as you say here, the Duna. We say the Danube. And he moved out of his birth home, though, or was moved out of his birth home at a very young age. I think he was 3 years old. His parents were divorced when he was very young. And he was taken to Galicia, where he was raised by his grandparents, his father's parents. His grandfather, Solomon Buber, is still a very famous Jewish scholar. Many Orthodox Jews, when you say the name of Buber, they have a kind of allergic reaction because Buber is famous for being anti-Orthodox, not just not Orthodox, but he was actually anti-mitzvot. He took a stance against the commandments. And so the name of Buber is anathema. But when I was in yeshiva, I remember pointing out to a bunch of students there that the midrash that they use in yeshiva is the Buber midrash. It says explicitly on the page, Buber midrash, right? And his grandfather, no less than him, his grandfather maybe was a little bit more religious, but he definitely was part of the movement that's known as the Haskalah. You can see even in this photograph, the hat, the kippah that he's wearing is definitely not a kippah that a religious man wears every day. It's more of a ceremonial kippah, right? Guys don't walk around with that kind of kippah from Jews. So he's a maskil. I don't know to what extent. I don't know to what degree. I don't know if he was certainly not as much as his grandson. But in any case, he was a very serious scholar, a successful man in his own right. He was a banker by profession, so he was independently wealthy, and so he was able to finance the publications of his own works. He was a philanthropist who gave money to all kinds of causes. He gave his books out freely to poor scholars who couldn't afford it. And of course, he had a strong influence on the grandson, on little Martin Buber, who from a very young age learned how to read Hebrew, and of course they spoke Yiddish. They also spoke Polish in the home. Buber at a very young age made a translation of Nietzsche into Polish. Buber also at a very young age, there was I believe in high school, when he was in gymnasium, he had a certain test in ancient Greek, and they asked him if he knew a certain passage by Plato. And young Buber promptly recited the passage in ancient Greek before explaining it. So Buber was an absolute polyglot. He could read many, many languages. He spoke English very well, French very well. He wrote in Hebrew in his old age. So he was a real polyglot. When Buber was a boy, his grandfather, Shlomo, even though he was not a chassid by any means, as I say, he was more of an academic, but for the Yamim Tovim, for the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and so on, he liked to go to the Hasidic shtibel. He felt, like many people, they feel, when you want to go to shul, do it right. Go where the people are serious and intent, excited and so on. So he used to take little Martin Buber to these Hasidic shtibels. And this was also a very important thing in Buber's life because Buber went on to write extensively about Hasidism. So the physical impact with Hasidim was something that lasted with him his entire life, which I'll get to in a second. Buber, at a fairly young age, joined the Zionist movement. If you're interested in the correspondences of Buber, you can see there's quite a bit of an exchange between the young Martin Buber and Theodor Herzl. In fact, within a couple of years, this is 1898, by 1902, Buber took over from Herzl the editorship of Die Welt, which was a publication that Herzl started, a Zionist publication. There were other publishers other than Buber, but Buber was definitely one of the editors of Die Welt. He was very busy in journals, in academic and intellectual journals. And another, probably the most famous one, was the one that he founded and was the editor-in-chief of, which was called Der Jude. Today, I don't think you could have such a...
The Jew.
Yeah, the Jew, right? The Jew. Jido.
Something with this name.
Right. What would you say? Oh, Jido, right? Yeah. You couldn't do it in any language, right? For sure, not even in English you could have the Jew, but certainly I think in German would be the worst, right? Der Jude. But at that time it was a respectable title. Eine Monatsschrift, which means a monthly journal. Buber went on to study in the University of Zurich, where he met Paula Winkler, who was described by an Israeli historian, Alon Amos, I think it is, in a beautiful book called The Pity of It All about German Jewry, as a brilliant Catholic writer from a Bavarian peasant family. I'm sorry, my blocking, I'll keep moving back and forth. So she was, I love her eyes, very captivating, beautiful eyes, young, outspoken, intelligent, Catholic woman who was not too happy about being Catholic. From a relatively young age, she was one of these Christian intellectuals who is not satisfied with the... I shouldn't say is not satisfied. In my life, I've met many Christians who want to understand Christianity. They really want to understand what's going on here. So if you want to understand Christianity, what do you have to do? You have to start studying Judaism. Because you want to understand the sources. You get that Jesus was a Jew, and that Jesus' mother was a Jew, and that Jesus' 12 disciples were Jews, and that Paul was a Jew, and that all the texts that they were reading were Jewish, and that they spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. So you want to understand what's going on. And as you investigate, some intellectuals, Christian intellectuals, they begin to realize, you know what? The substance here is Jewish. And Paula was one of these Christian intellectuals. And so in 1901, she officially left the Catholic Church. And 7 years later, she officially converted to Judaism and married Martin Buber. I don't know if she had a frum conversion, probably not. By Orthodox standards, we would not consider her Jewish because, Martin Buber himself didn't care. He was not a guy who cared about orthodoxy. As I mentioned, he was anti-Orthodox. But in any case, she did feel that she converted to Judaism, which is worth something. And she dedicated her life to Judaism and to Martin Buber. Here's a picture of them in their older age in Israel. We'll see in a second that they actually did make Aliyah. One very important person that is important to mention in Martin Buber's life is someone he befriended in 1921, Franz Rosenzweig, who was arguably the single greatest Jewish philosopher of the first half of the 20th century, probably greater than Buber, I would have to say. Although Buber outlived him because Rosenzweig died young, unfortunately, quite tragically. He contracted Lou Gehrig's disease and was trapped in his own body. His mind was trapped in his own body, so he died at a very young age. But he's unquestionably absolutely brilliant Jewish philosopher. And the two of them had not just a good friendship, but a very important collaboration in translating the Bible, the whole Tanakh, in other words, the Hebrew Bible, into German, which was known as the Verdeutschung der Schrift, the Germanization of Scripture. The term is important because in their Germanization, they not only translated the Tanakh into German, but they tampered with German. You remember in Peter Travny's classes, Peter often or sometimes mentioned that Paul Celan had to bend and twist and destroy even the German language in order to poetize in German. So in a sense, they did the same. They twisted the German around a bit in order to accommodate it to Hebrew. And it's a much respected translation. A lot of Christians use it because it's so interesting. It's such an interesting translation, and it's an attempt to capture Hebrew idiom to transfer Hebrew idiom into German. Rosenzweig, as I say, he died young, so he didn't manage to finish his collaboration with Buber. I forget exactly where they ended off. I believe they got as far as the Chumash. But after the Chumash, after the Pentateuch, Buber took over and translated the rest of the Tanakh by himself, based on their translation principles. In 1930 to 33, Buber held, I think, the only significant official post in a university in Frankfurt, at what came to be called the Goethe Universität. But in 1933, he left. Can anyone guess why? Why 1933? It's a good year to leave the German educational system, of course, because Hitler came to power, and Buber was incredibly sensitive to what was going on, and he was being a very sensitive Jew to what was happening. By the way, he was quite active right away. In 1933, it was still possible for Jews to have an active voice against the Nazi party. In other words, in newspapers and in institutions and so on. Very quickly it became impossible for Jews to be active, but Buber was for a couple of years active in openly opposing, in writing and in speaking against Nazism. By 1938, it was completely obvious to Martin Buber that Germany was not a place for a Jew to be, and so Buber made Aliyah. He became a professor at the Hebrew University, which was recently founded in Israel. And since he came to Israel in 1938 at the Hebrew U, until his death in 1965, which is a very important year for me because that was the year I was born. And when I was young, I really believed that I was a Gilgul of Martin Buber because of that. I happened to be 4 months into my sojourn in my mother's uterus at that time when Martin Buber left the world. So between 1938 and 1965, he was probably without question the most important Israeli intellectual. He lectured in Hebrew, he wrote in Hebrew. One anecdote which I told my daughter and I like to share, somebody once asked Buber at that time when he was in Israel, they say, Professor Buber, German is your best language, obviously. How is it in Hebrew? Do you find you're able to get your ideas across in Hebrew well enough in lecturing? And Buber said, well, when I lecture in Hebrew, I manage to make myself understood, but I don't think I manage to make myself misunderstood. So, because Buber, of course, was a very sophisticated speaker and writer, so when a person at that level, when you're speaking, it becomes obscure what you're saying. So he said, I'm not at that level. I can only make myself clear, that's all. And he lived in Yerushalayim, in this house, in the neighborhood that is known as Talbiya, which is an Arab neighborhood. I think we used to pass by his house when you used to go in Avat Israel. In Bethlehem, so on Derech Bethlehem, I believe I don't know if it's on Derech Bethlehem, but I believe it is in that direction. So he lived out his life in Yerushalayim with his wife, teaching at the university and so on, and writing. Here you can see him at his favorite Hebrew bookstore. I'm not sure where that is exactly. Buber, before, I think it was just a couple of years before he actually passed away in 1965, he was involved, like many authors are, in putting together his Werke, his collected works. His major works, it's not all of his works, by the way. There are many, many works that he wrote. I'll give you a short list soon. But these were his major works. And as you can see, what's so interesting about this is that it's divided into 3 more or less even volumes in size, in bulk, which are, if you can read this, the first volume, Erste Band, is Schriften zur Philosophie, philosophical works, which includes I and Thou. His second volume is Schriften zur Bibel, Bible, I don't want to say Bible commentary, he didn't write Bible commentaries. Buber was very influenced by biblical scholarship in the Germanic style, which was founded by Wellhausen and so on. So when you read Buber's Bible books, his Bible analyses, you will not find what Eric Lowy spoke about, Rashi and Rashbatz and Ralbag and these guys, and Sforno and Abarbanel. You'll find Wellhausen and Gerhard von Rad and these great German biblical scholars, most of whom were not Jewish, analyzing the Torah in a very scholarly, academic way. Buber, of course, was a deeply spiritual, even if he wasn't Orthodox, he was definitely a very spiritual, a very religiously sensitive thinker. So all of his Bible works, even though he's operating within this tradition of critical biblical scholarship, all of them have a positive take, whereas many of them would have a negative take. So where they might criticize Moses, and say, Buber always took pains to say, no, Moses is a great man. Moses is really talking to God. Moses really experiences revelation in some way. So he's probably the most religious of these Bible scholars, but nevertheless, he's not so religious as to be part of the camp of Rashi and the Abarbanel. And finally, the other volume, and this is another full volume, is a full third of his writings, is Schriften zum Hasidismus, writings on Hasidism, which focus mostly on the emotional, poetic, literary aspects of Hasidism rather than the intellectual. Buber was the intellectual who instigated the interest in Hasidism beyond Hasidism. Before Buber, the only people who knew about Hasidism were Hasidim. Buber was the one who opened it up, who said Hasidism is a fascinating thing, people, and became interesting. It became chic, became very vogue for intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals, non-Jewish intellectuals, to read about Hasidim. People soon became quite critical of Buber's approach. Most importantly, is Gershom Scholem was a very important intellectual who was also a German Jewish intellectual who lived in Yerushalayim and who wrote a wonderful critical essay on Buber's approach to Hasidism, where he says, first of all, you should know it's only because of Buber that all of us are looking at Hasidism. So he is definitely the Urvater who got us interested in this, but you should also know that I don't know why in all of his writings he never mentions a single intellectual work of Hasidism. And Scholem says in his essay, he says, in my library at home, I have 1,000 volumes of Hasidic thought. And Buber doesn't mention one of them. Not even one, like the Tanya, the obvious one, and so on, and the Likutei Ma'amarim, and so on. In any case, so Gershom Scholem accuses Buber, and I think he's right, of being interested in the mostly, because this was Buber's approach in general, in the emotional, spiritual, ecstatic, in the dancing Hasid. But the intellectual side of Hasidism was not something that Buber was terribly interested in. Fine. Here, by the way, is a short list of Buber's writings, most of which are in German, of course. And among all these works, what is interesting is that this one work from 1923 is by far his most famous. People who don't know much about Martin Buber, if you know a little bit about him, the first thing you know is that he wrote this book, Ich und Du, in 1923, which, as we'll see, does not mention Judaism explicitly and thematically very much. A couple sentences here and there, but mentions Buddhism and Hinduism, the Upanishads, and Jesus just as often as it mentions Jewish sources. So in terms of actual thematic content, there's nothing that makes this book particularly Jewish. However, as I hope we'll be able to develop, ideas that will develop, and you'll be able to see, in terms of what might be called conceptual terms, it's a very Jewish book. It's a deeply Jewish book in its approach to this content. Many people, it's not just Jewish. I mean, many people love this book who are not Jewish because it's a very humanist book. It touches a chord with every human being. But in terms of the idea behind it is a deeply Jewish idea. It's probably an idea that only a Jewish mind could formulate. Not because Jews are more brilliant. It may or may not be true. I'm not sure about that. But definitely Jews who are literate, in other words, Jews who are connected with their history and their literature, have a way of seeing reality which is deeply informed by the Torah to begin with, and by the rabbinic tradition, the midrashic tradition, which was his grandfather's input, by the Hasidic tradition, which produces this way of looking at reality that Buber encapsulates in this title, Ich und Du, I and Thou. We're going to have a lot of opportunity to discuss what that means. Having said that, I don't want to suggest that Buber is the only thinker who came up with this way of seeing things. He's probably the most explicit one, but by no means the only thinker. A couple who are worth mentioning. By the way, any questions so far? No? That's always, I'm glad you asked a question. Don't put up your hand, just interrupt me, okay? We're not polite here, right? No politesse here. Everybody just speak up, right? So, a couple of thinkers who are worth mentioning, especially because we'll mention them in our discussions here. I'm going to mention them in passing because their ideas touch upon Buber. Buber explicitly mentions, not in I and Thou, but in a later piece, in a collection called Between Man and Man, he mentions Ludwig Feuerbach, who was a great young Hegelian, as they were called, a post-Hegelian Hegelian, a left-wing Hegelian thinker, one of the great critics of Christianity. His most famous work is called Das Wesen des Christentum, the essence of Christianity, in which he distills the essence of Christianity and therefore critiques it. And in one of his works he mentions specifically Ich und Du, this idea of the Du, which I hope we'll have opportunity to look at. We together, Bense, you weren't there, but we examined one of the great works of 20th century Jewish philosophy together a couple of months ago by Hermann Cohen, in which Cohen also discusses the Du in German, the same German that Buber is writing in. Again, in passing, he doesn't deal with it by thematizing it to the extent that Buber does, but he certainly deals with this idea of the you, of the Du. His student, his most powerful and influential, I'll mention him in a second before we get to him. There's an interesting thinker named Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, who was originally a German, who emigrated to America and wrote, I think, most of his works. Actually, I'm not sure about that. He also wrote in English and in German and in English. Originally born Jewish, but converted to Christianity, I believe to Catholicism, but I'm not sure about that. Who wrote about what we're going to look at, I hope today, what Rosenzweig came to call grammatical thinking. He was, in fact, a friend of Franz Rosenzweig in his youth, whom we already mentioned, was a friend of Buber, so this is all a big happy family. Rosenzweig is a very handsome young man in this picture because there are very few pictures of Rosenzweig that are findable on the internet. The only other one is the one I showed earlier. So when Franz Rosenzweig was in the First World War as a German soldier in the trenches, he was sent an important manuscript, which we're going to look at soon, by Eugen Rosenstock, his friend, which deeply influenced him, and which dealt with this concept of thou, of the you. So Rosenzweig himself came to talk about the importance of I and you within the context of what he called grammatical thinking. And Rosenzweig, as I mentioned, was a close associate of Buber. There was a Christian thinker who was very much in vogue when I was a student at U of T in Canada, by the name of Gabriel Marcel, a French Christian thinker, born Christian, never touched Judaism, who independently came up. I don't think he read Buber, as far as I know. Or maybe he did, but you know what? I'm not sure, because he could have read him. I mean, and, you know, he wrote later than 1923, so he may have been influenced by Buber. But in any case, in his writings, and we'll have an opportunity to look at them, he does mention also the thou, je et toi, you know, the French version of ich und du. Finally, worth mentioning here is a man that we mentioned earlier, a thinker who is very, very close to my own heart, a Jewish Lithuanian thinker who died. I remember hearing about his death when I was still a student in Toronto from one of his students. I was sent an email by a man whose book I translated, and actually I translated his book, and I translated an essay by Levinas on his book. A man by the name of Philippe Nemo, who told me about the death of Emmanuel Levinas, and I remember at that time I even wrote to Levinas' son words of condolences. He never wrote back to me, but that's fine. Michael Levinas, but Emmanuel Levinas was probably the greatest Jewish thinker greatest Jewish philosopher, I should say. I'll explain what I mean by the difference between thinker and philosopher in a second, but definitely the greatest Jewish philosopher of the latter half of the 20th century. Levinas was, of course, knew Buber's writings very, very well, was deeply influenced by Franz Rosenzweig, probably even more than by Buber, and who was also critical of Buber's concept of ich und du. And again, we'll have opportunity to look a little bit at some of his criticisms and his takes on Martin Buber. Besides these, yeah, please.
Go on.
Yeah.
So Hermann Cohen is a German philosophy professor while Buber is already writing. Is there any direct contact between them?
You know what? That's a great question. I don't know, because they're not. I mean, Buber is younger, obviously, than Cohen. You know, Cohen, as we saw, he died. I believe he died in 1916, right? Yeah, 1918. Right, 1918. I hope that's the right, because, yes, 1918, because the book that we read is published 1919, posthumously, 1 year later. So Buber publishes I and Thou at 1923. Obviously, they could have met, but I don't know enough about Buber's biography to know if they actually did meet. Mm-hmm. Franz Rosenzweig definitely sat in Hermann Cohen's lectures and was explicitly a devotee of Hermann Cohen. He was a student of his. And Hermann Cohen had tremendous respect for Rosenzweig as a brilliant young Jewish thinker. But I don't know if it's a good question. I ordered a biography of Buber, a 3-volume biography, which I'm waiting for. So when it gets here, I'll be able to answer that question. Yeah. But in any case, it does at least show that the ideas of I and Thou are not. It's not Buber's patent. There are other people who've come up with these types of ideas, but Buber's the one who's made it most famous, because he's the only one who wrote a full book. It's not such a big book, but he's the only one who actually thematized this in such an explicit way. Now, these thinkers, as I mentioned, are Jewish philosophers, and the term philosopher is important here. They are either Jewish philosophers. Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, Emmanuel Levinas are Jewish philosophers. Gabriel Marcel, Eugen Rosenstock, you could say, are Christian philosophers, and therefore Judeo-Christian philosophers, they might call themselves, depending on whether Christians would like to use that hyphen, Judeo-Christian. And Ludwig Feuerbach, we could call an anti-Judeo-Christian philosopher, but in any case, Judaism plays a factor in all of their thinking as philosophers. What unites them in their mode of thinking, though, is philosophy, which means that their mannerism of thinking is, of course, in terms of its content, deeply informed by Judaism, but the manner of their thinking is not necessarily Jewish. The way that they think, that what's called the Denkenweg in German, what Heidegger called the Denkenweg, the mode of proceeding by thinking is more Greek than it is Jewish. And so at Hebrew U, for example, there are two departments at Hebrew U. One of them is called Jewish philosophy, and the other one is called Jewish thought. And that's a very important distinction. They're not the same thing. The distinction, you could say very basically, as I'm characterizing it, is that while Jewish philosophy is Jewish in content, in mode, it's Greek. Jewish thought, or what I prefer to call Hebrew thinking, just to emphasize that it's not Greek, but Hebrew, the thinking itself is Jewish, not just the content of the thinking. In Hebrew, it's known as Machshevet Israel, which is a term that was coined, if I'm not mistaken, by Rav Kook, the great religious Zionist thinker. And Machshevet Israel, or what's typically called Jewish thought, as I say, is a mode of thinking that is Jewish as well as where the content is Jewish. And so I would like to bring in, there may be more, this might reflect my bias, and please don't feel that you're bound to my biases. Obviously, I'm a devotee of Chabad, so I would like to bring in some ideas at some point from Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. If anyone knows other Jewish thinkers who have made similar ideas, I definitely hope you'll mention it. Maybe if this goes on Facebook or on the internet, somebody else will mention others to me. Yeah, so this is the founder of Chabad. Yeah, so Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi has one line in particular which I would like to treat as a kind of...
what is his sefer called?
Well, the Tanya is the sefer, yeah. Yeah, but at some point I want to look at a few passages from the Tanya, but more importantly at a statement that he made, which I'll treat as a kind of pre-Socratic statement about the Ich und Du, which I think is worth analyzing. But if anyone knows others, I would definitely appreciate knowing about them. If you had a chance to look at, no, sorry, not this, but Walter Kaufmann's wonderful English translation of I and Thou, just before the book begins, there's a page, this is on page, the page is not numbered, but it's on page 50. Here, there's a facsimile of a note that Walter Kaufmann himself found in the archives in Jerusalem when he was working on the translation, which was an outline that Buber put together in 1922. In other words, a year before Ich und Du was published, but after the text was actually completed. And this was an outline of a full five-volume work that Buber had planned, where Ich und Du would be the first volume. As it happened, he never wrote the other full 4 volumes. He felt it was way too systematic, and he was not interested in being a systematic philosopher like Hegel or whatever, or even Rosenzweig. So it was just Ich und Du. What's nice about this little outline, though, is that he gives us titles for the 3 parts of Ich und Du, which in the text itself he does not name. They just appear as part 1, part 2, part 3. That's it. But here he gave them titles: Wort, Geschichte, und Gott. Word, history, and God. And at the beginning I told you that I wanted to call this course Martin Buber's Wort in honor of the first part. I would like to focus as much as possible on the first part of this book, to read it slowly and carefully. We'll see how fast we can get through it, and depending on how fast we get through it, then we'll move to the other 2 parts. But I think the first part is the most foundational, so it's worth dwelling on it to have a good grasp of what Buber is trying to do in part 1. So this is why I want to deal with Martin Buber's Wort, and of course the Wort, the word that is in question, is very, very specifically this word Du in German. The word which Walter Kaufmann discusses at great length in his introduction of how to translate. It's not an easy word to translate into English, and by the way, you guys will tell me Hungarian. I don't know if it's a problem in Hungarian, but at some point I want to discuss what I would say is really the Ashkenazi, to bring it to the Ashkenazium, the Ashkenazi problem with the word do. It's really a problem for Ashkenazi thinking, the word do, because the word doesn't, because of it's not easily, doesn't sit well with either Hebrew or with English.